We thought that we would start tonight by having Domnica read just a short passage of the book, from the book, to give a little sense of the tone and experience of reading it. So we will kick off with that.
Good evening. Thank you, everyone, for being here. The age of 7 was also when I fell in love with Maria, the girl from Sarajevo. Her parents had moved to Belgrade because her father was a flute player and had gotten a position in the Belgrade Philharmonic. Her first day of classes, she stood in the doorway with a mischievous smile and dark waves of hair that fell smoothly onto her shoulders. She was both self-assured and dreamy. I was stunned by her beauty, and the second I saw her, I wanted nothing more than to be friends with her for life. I felt that as long as Maria was in my life, everything was going to be all right. I would even get over my name hang-up if she were the one to pronounce it. I went straight to her and asked her to share my school bench with me. I was always seated by myself because the teacher said I disrupted my desk mates with my constant talking. But I was not going to let go of Maria. She looked straight at me with a clear smile and followed me to my desk as if it was the most obvious thing in the universe that we were going to be desk mates and friends for life. She carried almond, sesame, and honey desserts in her backpack and little sparkling trinkets, some jewelry, some simply for the fun of the jingle and the sparkle. She put some on our desk, and suddenly we were no longer in the drab classroom with a picture of President Tito hanging on the wall in front of us, but in an enchanted castle in Persia or Morocco, somewhere with orange trees, sparkling beaches, and flashy belly dancers. When Maria and I learned about the process of parthenogenesis in our biology class, we were ecstatic. Some birds, reptiles, amphibians, and even bees could reproduce through asexual reproduction by a process of cell division that did not involve the sexual act between a male and a female. That meant, said Maria, stuffing her face with one of her delicious honey almond desserts and giggling at the same time, that she and I could have children together without needing a man. All we needed was the love and willpower to divide our own cells and produce offspring. If frogs could do it, so could we, said Maria triumphantly. We were 9 years old and everything was possible, producing children through asexual reproduction, battling villains with our sleek, shiny swords, and living in a tiny castle at the very top of a snowy mountain, somewhere in a place called the Wild West.
Well, that gives you a little sense of our main characters. When the book was submitted to me, I read it, I think the night that it came in, and I think I read it in one sitting because I was so caught up with how human it was and how fantastic the characters were, and there were sort of warts and all. You really got a sense that these were complicated girls/women. And the reviews, the book has only been on sale for about a week. The reviews have just started coming in. I just wanted to read one, a little piece of one, and then we really are going to start with the Q&A, just because I was so moved by it. It says, Country of Red Azaleas is a searing, powerful work of fiction. Radulescu's imagery is evocative, but the real triumph here is her characters. These women feel wholly authentic, a fierce and beautiful novel that is, in many ways, an immigrant story, a war story, and a love story, all at once. It is one of the most unique and well-crafted of its kind. Just is pretty nice, and I think it's true. But I was very surprised when I discovered that English wasn't her first language. And to me, that put you in a group of very interesting writers like Nabokov and Conrad. And I thought you could maybe talk about writing in English.
As a second language?
As a second language, yeah.
There are actually quite a few writers out there that write and that have over the centuries even written in several languages, or at least two. Bilingualism or even trilingualism has been particularly common among immigrant writers, but also among writers of languages of small circulation, such as Romanian, Polish, sometimes indigenous languages. Other of my compatriots, for instance, such as Paul Celan, Émile Cioran, They have Eugenionesco. They have adopted French or German as their language of artistic expression, coming from a small language such as Romanian, one of the 5 Romance languages. But language is a complicated and also is an adventure for a writer, and for an immigrant writer who has to forsake and to cut themselves off for what in some languages is called not native but maternal language, the first words, the first expressions, linguistic expressions that one has to connect with the world and to name it, and to break away from that and start writing in a different language. It requires a very intensive process of reinvention, of recreation, because we don't just speak a language, we inhabit a language. We love, we hate, we die in a language. Therefore, language is its own country, and for the immigrant writer in particular, once we break away from the country, from the language, starting to write in a different language implies a very profound uprooting for oneself. But it is also a very exciting adventure, because you have the opportunity to reinvent yourself. And English is a wonderful language for fiction. I have always been drawn to it since I started learning it at the age of 10. French was my second language, actually, and English my third. So I think it's a very interesting adventure, and it's exciting to write in another language.
I also was really struck by the fact that this is not only a novel about friendship, but about the complications of a friendship and the journey of a friendship. And I was wondering how you came to write about these women and about their journey.
Yes, their friendship is actually a country in its own, a country of itself, and it is the force that moves the narrative and the plot along. And it has many dimensions. It is a very complete relationship that works and that unfolds throughout the story at many levels, at the emotional, spiritual, intellectual level, and physical level. It evolves throughout the book that way. And it evolves in a way in which I hope that the reader realizes that these women just in the end cannot live one without the other. They have very different and complicated paths and journeys, and at some point when the war starts, their journeys and their paths separate and take very different directions, quite dramatic directions. But the knowledge that the other one exists out there in the world, and this connection that they've established that day when they met when they were 7 years old, goes with them and carries them throughout their lives as a life-affirming force, and as something that they always need to get back to. I don't want to say more because I don't want to give too many spoilers.
Stop.
Yeah.
So in addition to being about friendship, the book is also about love and all the different forms and kinds of love that I think exist. And maybe you could talk a little bit about love. We love talking about love.
Yeah. I think it is a love story, very much so, in many ways. Principally, it's a love story of these two women. But Lara, who is the narrator of the story as well, she doesn't really realize how crucial to her own sense of self and being Maria is until decades later. Maria knew it all along. But Lara also has quite interesting and winding and meandering path, and several encounters with love. She gets married. She marries an American that she meets at the start of the war in Belgrade, and she thinks she loves him. She goes to America and she becomes an immigrant. And so that's why also the story, it's an immigrant story, and it's a story of surviving war as well. So he represents to her the American maleness and charm, but also really her opportunity to leave and to leave a country at war. So that is one aspect of love, spousal love. Love in the family. There are different types of family in the book as well that are developed. And love between lovers, and motherhood is the love of children and the fierceness of that love of motherhood, almost ferocious, I would say, is also a running thread through the novel, and it is also one of the threads that carries through the plot. Again, I don't want to give away too much, but and the love of children and maternity is also very poignant in a different way, this being also a story inspired by war, because children are the very antithesis of war, and they are the force that is the life-affirming. They represent the future and history, whereas war is the annihilation of all that. And
well, that was my next question, actually. I'm going to interrupt you. I said, now that we're talking about love, let's talk a little bit about war and how the war figures into the book.
Yeah, you know, all's fair in love and war. As someone said, all was not fair in this war that inspired my novel, the Balkan War of the 90s, in which more than 100,000 Muslim Bosnians were killed. Maybe I should just say a couple of words about the history of the war. So it was largely a genocidal war of ethnic cleansing that started in 1992, and it was mostly carried out by Serbian armies that then became the Republika Srpska, and were meant to really destroy and annihilate Muslim Bosnians. Sarajevo, the city of Sarajevo, was under siege for 3 years under the terror of snipers, and 10,000 Sarajevians died, 1,000 children. People lived without electricity, without gas. Water was very hard to get without water. When I traveled there, I got so many amazing stories of survivors, and my book is very much a book about surviving war. It is not a war story, it is a story of friendship and love in times of war and displacement, and it is very much about how people survive. And I found extraordinary stories as I was talking to survivors. Sometimes little details, such as why people dressed up on some days in their Sunday's best to just have a sense of normality, or to know that if they're going to die in their best. Or how a woman at the height of the war told me, she was a poet too, and she said that her strongest desire during the war was to have a child, and she did, and she met me with her 14-year-old daughter. Or how a mother was crossing the street with a 6-year-old boy, and in the middle of the crossing he was shot by a sniper. How people were shot buying bread. And also how people survived and established extraordinary strategies of survival, and still stubbornly clung to moments of beauty and love, such as writing poetry, having the poetry reading in a basement, having a rock concert to just defy the snipers. So this war haunted me when it started, and it is the reason why it became the inspiration for my book, because I'm also a daughter of survivors of World War II, and I grew up in the sound of my parents' war stories in Romania, both first part when Romania was on the side of Germany, and then when Russian troops drove their tanks in. And this is the last thing I will say about this, because I think it's very poignant in terms of the details that I try to capture in terms of the aftermath of war, and also why I developed such a visceral relationship with this war, and how it ended up being transformed into my work of fiction. I have always heard the story of about my maternal grandparents, who were standing during one of the raids, one of the bombings, during World War II in one side of their house, and an American bomb fell on the other side, just a few feet away, and they were lucky to be a few feet away from the half of the house that was crushed. And needless to say, if they had been in that side, I wouldn't be here talking with you, and my beautiful son wouldn't be there either. So, as one of the characters in my novel says, life hangs on so little. And I think this is also what I try to convey, this sense of very acute and desperate clinging to life and mortality that one acquires through experience of war.
To me, there's the sense of place and atmosphere is almost like a character in the book. So it's very powerful. Was that important to you when you were writing the book, and if so, why? And tell us a little bit about
It's
that.
always important, and it is important in all my
I'm giving her
writing.
some softball questions, because, you know.
The sense of place and of experiencing the world in a very sensuous and multidimensional way is part of how I myself experience the world, and it always transpires into my writings. And I think, unlike journalism or history books, literature has the ability to, the lie of fiction has the ability to take us to deeper truths about the human condition and about life and about our journey on this planet. And in particular, our experience in the world as a sensual experience in the moment and in our bodies and in the totality of our experience and our interactions with the world, mind, body, spirit, is very important. And I think it creates the sense of place, and the sense of atmosphere gives a lot more weight and richness to the experiences in which the characters through which the characters go. I mean, everything happens in a space, in a place, but when particularly dramatic things happen to the characters or to us in life, right? We remember the way the sun was slanted on a certain day, the feel of the sun, the color of the azaleas, the smell of the linden flowers, all of that influences our mood, our perception of reality, and the ways in which we experience a certain event. And one other thing that I would like to say with regards to place is one detail that has haunted me in writing this book that comes from my research about the war, about the Bosnian War, namely that the Eighth Day Genocide that happened in July of 1995, when 8,000 men were of ages from 14 through the 60s were brutally killed, execution style. It all happened under a very, very clear blue sky and bright sunshine. And somehow that is, to me, such a wrenching image of humanity at its very most criminal and its very worst, being sort of obscenely at work and exhibited under the stunning beauty of nature. And when I traveled there, actually, to Srebrenica at one of the anniversaries of the end of the war, the same very warm weather, brilliant sky and sunshine. One would normally connect awful events with a Dantesque picture of rain and
It's like
darkness.
that here on 9/11. It was a beautiful day.
So one can never be fooled about what happens on Earth on beautiful days. Awful things happen on beautiful days.
I love the title of this book. I hope everybody else does. And I wondered how you came upon it.
It didn't first have this title. It wasn't its first title.
I don't think I knew that.
No, you didn't know that. I left it for now. The first title was Lara's Loves And Lara, the name of the character, she gets this name because her parents were obsessed with the film Dr. Zhivago. And because there are, as you pointed out, different kinds of love in the book, and Lara experiences those. She has a very love-rich life, and she's also open to love. This was the first title. Then a second title was because subtext and another underlying cinematographic allusion to the book is Casablanca, the movie Casablanca. So another title was We Won't Always Have Paris.
So far, I'm loving the one we went with.
But then, the summer when I went to Sarajevo, something just happened when I connected with the city, and just this incredible lush explosion of flowers in a city that was recovering, that was a recovering city from the destruction of war, and was trying to move on and to be beautiful again and be full of life and vibrancy. I just had an epiphany. And country, the word country also is very important for the book, and it's important for me because I've changed countries and the characters change countries, so it's such a full, loaded word that carries a lot of the significance of the book itself. And then Red Azaleas, this explosion of life, but also the country of Red Azaleas, it's not always a beautiful country. It's a magical country. It's also a dark country. It has ambivalent meanings in the book. So this is how I came upon the title.
That was interesting for me to hear. The book focuses on so many of life's atrocities, and yet it's not a depressing book, and in fact it's the opposite of being a depressing book. And I wanted you to talk about how you accomplished that. You know, was it through the craft of writing it, and just how did you take all these terrible things and not write a book that just, you know, made you want to throw yourself out the window after you've read it?
Yes, in fact, people who have friends who have read the book already, they have said that they're so surprised that they're expecting it to be just darkness and gloom, and it's not. It has a lot of color, it has beauty, it has love, it has moments of happiness, it has also humor, I think. At times, I think so.
Well, the little thing you just read us was very funny.
Right. But I think that is one characteristic of my craft in general, but in particular for this book, because the subject and the inspiration is so dark, and the heroines survive, particularly Maria, survive such awful traumas. I felt, in fact, even more of an aesthetic and ethical urge, actually. I think the aesthetic and the ethical are often interconnected in my writing, to, in fact, respond to the awfulness of the violence with a craft that is, that resists that. And let me explain. Not in a way that fetishizes violence, not in a way that glorifies it, absolutely not, but in a way in which the experience of trauma is transcended through an imaginative process, through imaginative processes, and really focuses on ways of survival and of finding meaning after trauma, finding beauty and finding love after trauma. And as an artist, I have a problem with very realistic descriptions of violence, in fact, and I never, my books all have a dark side to them, and they're either about terrible losses of country, of family.
Well, life has a dark side.
And dark has a life side, but I think there is something perverse in very detailed and very realistic recapitulations of violence, and particularly of physical violence. And to me, the way in which trauma can be transcended and moved to healing through art is if that violence, yes, is honored in its awfulness, and if the truth about it is told, but in ways in which it is also, trauma is also processed, and the characters are given the chance to move beyond that. And this is what I actually found, that the people, Sarajevians, everybody wanted to move on, to grab life, to grab beauty. So the colorfulness of the style comes largely from that. I felt even more, because the subject is so dark, of a need to give these characters a chance to move into beauty again, into love again, through very, very wrenching processes. Never mind, but of course.
I think you accomplished it, so.
Thank you.
Now the question, the crowd pleaser question that everybody always wants to know, how is this book connected to your own life? Personal.
Oh, in many, many ways, but not in ways that would be very as obvious as my first book, Train to Trieste, which everybody asked me if it was autobiographical. But really in all the ways in which my various obsessions and the things that haunt me, the experiences that haunt me, end up being transferred and channeled and processed into my art. So the uprooting, the experience of being an uprooted individual in this world, of having left my country and resettled and being somewhat of a nomadic citizen of the world, and always looking for a home, always looking for a place to belong. Though I have lived in the same home in Virginia for the last 20 years, but also I connect with many other places in the world, such as New York. There are many urban sites in the book. This is also, in many ways, a picaresque novel. It is the novel of a journey, and of several journeys, of journeys within journeys, of these two characters that cross cultures, cross landscapes, cross geographies, languages, and reconstruct themselves and reinvent themselves. And it is also a story of two women who are, in a way, in terms of the canon of literature, of the literary canon, the response to the great male figures like Ulysses and Patroclus, Dante and Virgil, the great male adventurers and travelers. These are two women travelers and heroines and warriors, in a different way warriors. So this kind of very troubled, tormented journey through the world that comes from many of my experiences, the experience of motherhood and of the sense of vulnerability that one acquires when one is a mother, the experience of being a mother and giving birth to children that are of a different nationality than you are, that sense of rupture, of, my children are American, like Lara's daughter is American, and we are from different continents. We have a continent and that's, the children of immigrants themselves, like Natalia, Lara's daughter, they carry a certain baggage, and also they have a different take on the world, and they're the ones who are rooted. They are the ones who root us.
Well, that's the perfect segue to my next question, because you write a lot about being uprooted and displaced. So I think we should talk a little bit about immigration and how it figures into the book.
Yes, I think I said a lot about that. Well, both characters are end up being immigrants and being displaced by war. So what's new, right? It's going on and on. That's why, in a way, unfortunately, the book is still so profoundly relevant to now, because Maria is a survivor of war. She, luckily, fortunately for her, by a various circumstances, a set of circumstances, ends up in Los Angeles. So she immigrates. Lara is the first one to immigrate. So the story of immigration is a story of our century, very much so, and it keeps going on. And through the experience of the loss of country, as the poet Joseph Brodsky said, when one exiles oneself and when one runs away, usually you run away from something worse to something better. So hopefully there is something better. But the experience of rerouting itself, that experience it's in itself, which my characters do, they reroute themselves, and which I have been doing it for quite a while now, it's a paradoxical experience. It comes with a lot of pain and a lot of joy. It's a loss, it's some kind of a death, and it is also a chance for reinvention, for a rebirth. The critic Edward Said said a line that has always touched such a profound chord with me in terms of this experience of exile and immigration. Namely, he said, exile is the unhealable rift between a being and a native place. Its sadness can never be surmounted. And I think this melancholy runs through the novel and moves the characters, and they carry it with them, and they become used to it, just like one learns to live with lost limb or lost part of themselves. But then the experience of immigration towards a better place also gives extraordinary energy. So also gives the energy towards recreation and towards new beginnings. So this is why it is such a complicated and such a paradoxical dual experience of death and rebirth, of loss and gaining something. And you know, all the loitering refugees with untellable stories, as Said called all the refugees that are filling the world right now, they offer a very wrenching, a very sad image of humanity. And their experiences, there are as many refugee stories as there are refugees, but their experiences really cannot be conveyed, cannot be ever fully conveyed, because it is the experience of exile is really an ontological experience. Once you leave your country, once you're in exile, you cannot unexile yourself. It's like a psychological death in a way. If you die, you can be undead, unless you're a Romanian vampire. But
I'm going to ask one more question before we open it up for questions from the audience. So we've talked a lot about the friendship between the women, and these are women who have husbands and lovers and male husbands and lovers, but there's also a very erotic sense of things between them, and I thought you could talk about that.
Yes, of course, from the very beginning. They feel this great attraction towards one another, only that it takes them quite a long period of their adulthood to realize that. In fact, I think Maria knew it from very early on while they were in college and sharing the same lover. They were wild girls while they were in college.
That makes you want to read it, doesn't it?
And Lara was not really very much aware, and she throws herself into several experiences, marriage, adultery, and it takes her a while. She only understands the full attraction that she has towards Maria towards the very end.
But do you think this is common with many, or is it particular to these two?
I wouldn't know if it's common. It is a very complete relationship, and this women can, they have an erotic attraction towards one another. They want to be with each other, and they realize as they go through life that's I don't want to
No,
give away. I don't want to give
How
away.
about-
I don't want to
we
give
get to
away
the
the
questions
ending.
now.
No, I don't want to give
Yeah,
away the
don't give
ending.
anything
But
away.
my surprise is frankly when it comes to the reviews is that everybody's been so shy in pointing that out. Everybody just uses friendship. And everyone uses friendship. Yes, code for love.
Euphemism.
I mean, yeah, they sleep in the same bed. They kiss on the mouth in the forest. I don't know. Is it common? I think there is more than just friendship. I mean, whether it's between men and a woman or two men or two women, I think it takes more than just friendship when you start kissing someone on the mouth and sleeping with them in the same bed. It takes a little, you know, it's...
Right, so on that note, do anybody have questions?
Actually, I'm Yelena Schmolenson. I'm your audiobook
Oh my
narrator.
goodness, you were the one from radio!
Which I just was, you were saying about but I wanted just to say something because you talked about how you don't like graphic
Violence.
but it's the same, it's so obviously, at least to me when I was reading it, a love story between two women,
Yeah.
but because it's so non-explicit, that it reads just a really
Right.
close friendship, and then you think, oh gosh, is my mind so, why am I thinking that these women are more than just friends, that they want to be more than friends? But it's so beautifully, the relationship is, through the years, is so beautifully written that it's like on the verge of, being love.
Yes.
As we understand.
It's subliminal. It's like when they say buy
Right.
Coke in the movie.
Yeah, and you're just like, did I get that message, or was it just a little bit?
No, I think it's there.
But it's not just on the verge, it crosses the verge.
I agree.
Uh,
I think it crosses.
And also, love is love. That's why I didn't want to name it in any way.
Yeah.
I didn't, I think I stay away from boxing people and putting people in relationships in boxes and labeling them. I think love is love, and they're just two human beings who love one another in all the ways. And yeah, they want to sleep with each other too. More and more as the book progresses. And they have other adventures. I was going to read a few.
Right, I just wanted to see if they had
What,
more
are you going to
questions.
have questions or?
Well, we had
read?
one. Do we have any others? Just want to make sure before you. Yeah,
Yes.
let's finish the questions.
Well, this is a little tangential, but every time I come upon the word Sarajevo, I think, oh no, there's that word, and I don't know how to pronounce it. And you have to come upon it if you're ever going to read about World War, any war.
Sarajevo.
So this is the first night I ever heard it said right.
Oh.
So thank you very much.
Oh, okay.
You had to say it
Yes,
in the
how
audio.
did you-
I had, and we looked a lot of words up, but it's also,
Yeah.
I'm from Russia. I'm also a displaced person, from 20 years from Russia, and in Russia we say Sarajevo. For some reason.
Sarajevo with
Sarajevo, the stress
Sarajevo,
is on the
Sarajevo.
hot, and so then I have
You
like,
had to
where's
change it for the audio.
Yeah, but in American news I know they say Sarajevo, but there's like extra.
Yeah.
So I went with the Yugoslavian Serbian pronunciation. There were a lot of pronunciations.
There are pronunciations. I know we worked on that. I recorded myself, and also then Maria is not Maria, is Maria.
Right.
Which also, again, like you have to look up the Serbian and the Bosnian pronunciation versus the traditional Slavic and American pronunciation. But I was the same. There are 37 pronunciations of that word.
Any other questions or comments? Well, then let's end with. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm just curious in terms of your research. Had you had a trip that triggered this, or was it? You said something about how you got the idea for the story. Did you go there after you had already begun the story?
Yes, exactly. Yes, I had the idea of writing it quite a bit before, and I had started it, and it has been sort of the trajectory of my writing processes. I start a novel, and then about places I haven't been. This is how I started Train to Trieste. And then, my novels end up being my travel agents too. And then I have to go to the place. So I felt, of course, they have to go. And my dear son Nicholas accompanied me through that whole journey. Sarajevo We went through Srebrenica as well, very, very dark places, and saw the sinister camps and the town of Srebrenica where the atrocities happened, and very, very dark memories. It was a very dark journey, and I sort of immersed myself in it very completely and viscerally, and went through a dark period because of it. But I felt otherwise I couldn't have written this novel, because this is how I was able to draw the reality of it and to become these characters. And I talked to a lot of people and survivors, and that was the most important part of my research, other than also reading a lot.
We thought we would end where we began, with a little bit of Domnica reading from the book.
So I'll read now a small part from the beginning, precisely to answer to the question about love, and then I will read another part during Lara's marriage that particularly stresses this drama of being an immigrant. When Maria, sorry, wrong start. Sometimes Maria and I tried to kiss each other like we had seen the actors in the movie do it. Maria's lips were velvety and tasted bittersweet, like the desserts her mother made. We fell asleep holding hands, and I traveled to colorful, sugary lands where Clark Gable was the president of our country, and the First Lady was none other than Marilyn Monroe. The president and his wife lived in the Beli Dvor, which was where President Tito normally resided, but now it was occupied by Clark Gable and Marilyn Monroe. Maria and I were ladies-in-waiting for the First Lady, and we wore poofy magic dresses with hoops that swirled and swished and that even made us swoop over the marble stairways and banisters of the palace like weightless balloons. In the morning, Maria and I shared our dreams. Hers were always about chases and fights. She would save me from pirates and gangsters and Apache Indians while riding a wild stallion and swishing above her head a glittering saber that shone and sparkled in the setting sun and blinded all the enemies into submission. She carried me off on her stallion, and we rode into the sunset. All throughout my college years in Belgrade, throughout my later year on a different continent, throughout the years of the war, and after the war, the image of us racing through the back alleys of Sarajevo, with our mouths puckered from stolen fruit, our hearts booming out of our chests, the cupolas of the mosques glistening in the sunset, and the hills of Sarajevo sprinkled with white houses and red azalea bushes, like a huge, colorful, and throbbing nest of life, was always me as a reminder that I had once held a corner of heaven in my hands. And really, this book is a lot about the fall from paradise. That is their paradise, and the fall, and Dante's Inferno is mentioned quite a few times too. And now the passage. Maria is now married with Mark and living on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C. One day I told Mark I wanted us to start cooking at home and not go out to eat all the time. Even when we ate at home, Mark brought in takeout Indian, Chinese, or Mexican from one of the restaurants in our neighborhood. We sat across from one another at his large mahogany dining room table, eating out of cardboard boxes like we were in an airport or railway station. I thought it was the American way, easy, fast, disposable, prepared by someone else, usually an illegal immigrant working in the kitchen. I found myself missing the dinners with my parents. As heavy and greasy as some of my mother's cooking was, at least it was served in beautiful china with rose or sunflower motifs on the edge of the plates. I called my mother for a goulash recipe, thinking that I'd tone down the fat and salt and add some fresh vegetables and American spices, and it couldn't be too bad. My mother couldn't believe her ears that I was calling her for a recipe. She asked me how I was doing and told me again how lucky I was and updated me on the ever-growing violence of the war. Mark shopped for every ingredient on the grocery list with rigor and enthusiasm, proudly unloading each item like it was an artifact for a museum. We prepared the meal side by side, and for the first time I had a sense of home and did not feel like a tourist on a limited visa. Mark played a Beatles record and once or twice even swirled me across our blue Italian kitchen tile floors in between browning the beef and caramelizing the onions. It was a hot, humid summer evening in Washington, and the fragrance of honeysuckle entered our kitchen, merging with the smell of cooking beef and onions. It reminded me of the smell of beef stew on the evening when Mark and I visited my parents for the first time. The Beatles' music made me more nostalgic than the stew, reminding me of the high school parties at Maria's house for her birthday. Mark's presence made me feel safe and cozy, yet the mixture of smells and music overlapping onto my memories from a country and family at the other end of the world also gave me a feeling of vertigo. I was hanging above a transcontinental precipice, and I could have been anybody or no one at all. I could have been an opportunistic hairdresser, a greedy Serbian-American housewife, a double agent working for the Bosnian Federation and the UN. Mark was the only one to hold on to remind me I was Lara Kulic, a political science graduate from Belgrade University, born and raised in a modest Serbian apartment by intellectual parents in love with Hollywood movies. He alone was a witness to my heritage. He could recite entire sets of Shakespeare sonnets by heart. He even liked to prepare Serbian goulash with me on a humid August evening when all our neighbors were eating Ethiopian or Thai takeout from cardboard boxes. It was a new kind of happiness, but it was one that obliterated entire portions of myself. This must be the immigrant experience. There were no roots, just lots of leafy branches reaching out towards the starless Washington evening, the great American night with 24-hour supermarkets, millionaires, homeless people, truck drivers, movie stars, neoclassical granite buildings, high-rises, malls, and everything else in between. It felt hopeless and exhilarating. As we sat across from each other at the long mahogany table like an aristocratic British couple from a BBC series, proudly eating our American version of Serbian goulash, I looked at Mark and tried to figure out who he was at his core. I was desperate to find the rawest and crudest part of him, a burning, quivering point of truth and vulnerability behind the witty conversations, perfect dance moves, Shakespeare sonnets, steady thoughtfulness, and occasional distance he took whenever he prepared for his classes. That night, I cried quietly in my pillow. Mark kissed me goodnight, and he said I would feel better in the morning. I probably drank too much, he said. The future was gaping in the dark like an open crater. I cuddled close to Mark, and his calm breathing and warm body was soothing. Despite everything, I was glad he was there sleeping next to me. What would I have done all alone in a bed in a foreign city, in a foreign country, not a soul who cared or knew who I was? Somebody called for Bobby in the street outside our window and laughed heartily. For some reason, that felt reassuring. The honeysuckle smell felt reassuring too, reminding me of another night back home. Thank you.